Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, Premier Doug Ford says if Donald Trump wants to smack tariffs on Ontario, then we'll turn out the lights on New York, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
Ford government has also put forward its proposed legislation on how to end homeless encampments across the province. We'll check out the details.
We'll also look into the proposed laws the government needs to pass before the end of the year. Plus, we'll catch up on the onpoli mailbag and answer your questions.
In Your Column, My Column, I'll focus on two of those specific bills on the order paper and what they tell us about the lessons of COVID.
And my column is going to focus on a recent speech by author, journalist, and commentator David Frum on whether the pendulum of what's acceptable history to teach is swinging back.
It's Friday, December 13th, 2024, our last episode of the year, so let's get to it.
JMM?
Oh, sir.
Our last sugar for the year.
Absolutely, yes. Friday the 13th.
Triskaidekaphobia Day.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. You know what yesterday was, eh?
Not offhand, but I await your information.
This disappoints me. I thought for sure you would have this at the tip of... It ought to be a national holiday, frankly.
Okay.
Yesterday. Yes, I mean, look what I'm wearing.
Oh, Frank Sinatra.
Look, there you go. Can't see it in that shot over here. Yeah, I got to show it here. Okay.
Yes. Frankie.
Yeah. There.
Double Frankie.
It was his birthday yesterday. Mr. Sinatra would have been 109 years old yesterday.
Wow, okay.
And as I say, should be a national holiday, don't you think?
Yes, well, it's about that time of year that I'm listening to a lot of Christmas carols, and Frankie Sinatra.
He's all over it.
Great Christmas carols.
He's all over it, man. Yeah, I agree. Okay, on this we agree. Let's do one little who's running and who's not update before we dive into our three issues today. We learned early yesterday morning, Ross Romano, the MPP for Sault Ste. Marie, former cabinet minister for the Progressive Conservative government, not running again. So the Tories have got to find themselves a candidate for up in the Soo.
Yeah, he won that seat after the Liberal MPP, David Orazietti, resigned. As we mentioned a few weeks ago, it's one of the last by-elections of the Parliament right before Ford won, and without speculating too much here, he was a cabinet minister. He is no longer in cabinet. He has other opportunities to explore. Clearly,
it's tough to be an ex-cabinet minister.
Yeah,
it is tough. Yeah. Anyways, lots to talk about today. So let's get on to our three issues. Away we go. It was a deeply upset Premier of Ontario who told reporters earlier this week that if Donald Trump tries to tariff our goods going south, he'll retaliate by refusing to sell power to several American states. Let's have a look.
We will go to the full extent, depending how far this goes. We will go to the extent of cutting off their energy, going down to Michigan, going down to New York State and over to Wisconsin. I don't want this to happen, but my number one job is to protect Ontario, Ontarians and Canadians as a whole, since we're the largest province.
Okay, Premier Ford does admit that there's a certain cutting off your nose to spite your face in that action because, obviously we don't sell our power to them. We're going to lose some of the revenue we would otherwise realize. But the Premier's position is Ontario cannot sit idly by while the incoming president threatens our future prosperity. Pay no attention to what the weather's doing outside. I just felt the temperature go up. How about you?
Several U.S. states purchase electricity from Ontario, particularly New York State, but also, I believe, Michigan, Ohio. We went through the list earlier.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Major industrial states, right? We're not donating this electricity out of charity, right? So we would lose revenue. Potentially, I guess, public revenue, if it's like OPG, like the provincial utility, that suddenly is not able to sell its electricity. But on the flip side, you could imagine there would be damage to the American economy as well if the American side of the American electricity consumers suddenly are not able to get the electricity they need. There is one thing that I will add, just because this has been relevant in Ontario's past. It might also be bad for air quality. Ontario's power grid is greener, cleaner generally than a lot of the U.S. Midwestern states. And if they respond to a shortage of Ontario-made electricity by, restarting old coal plants or whatever, you could imagine that making the air quality worse, not just for U.S. states, but of course, like we all breathe the same air.
All breathing the same air, and the wind tends to come up in this direction. So
Yes.
that's a great point.
Yeah, so that'll be something that we want to watch out for. Federally, the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Christopher Freeland, has confirmed that the federal government is considering responding with tariffs of its own. And the federal government is also proposing $1 billion in additional border security spending in the hopes that this will mollify the incoming president-elect.
We do know how much affection the current Premier of Ontario has for booze. So needless to say, I need to ask a follow-up question here about whether or not there's a booze angle on this story.
Is there always a booze angle in Ontario
There seems
politics?
to be. There seems to be. Yeah.
Yes, our colleagues at Global News reported on Thursday that one option being considered is having the LCBO limit or even halt its purchases of U.S.-made alcohol. The LCBO is, of course, the world's largest single customer for alcohol, so that's a pretty substantial threat. It's also the only legal wholesaler for grocery stores and convenience stores in the province of Ontario. The beer store, which is privately owned and importantly in this context, it is American-owned mostly, would still be allowed to stock U.S. beer. But if you were looking to get California wines or Kentucky bourbon, if this proposal were to go through, that would be harder to find.
That would go for Tennessee whiskey as well. And the reason I mention that is because Jack Daniels, Tennessee whiskey, is the drink that this guy always loved to have. I'm going to get as many Sinatra references into our podcast today as I possibly can. But first, it's off to issue 2. Last week, we mentioned that there's legislation in the works around encampments of homeless people that would provide municipalities with funding to temporarily house them. However, if met with resistance from the courts, the Premier has said he will use the notwithstanding clause of the Constitution to set aside the rights of the homeless to ensure those encampments are eliminated. Premier Ford yesterday confirmed legislation is on the way. Let's have a look at some of his comments and some of those from the Mayor of Oshawa, Dan Carter.
You know, homeless people, we want to help them. We want to find shelter for them. We want to get a roof over their head, get them back out there working and finding a job. I don't think you just heard me. The people that are using illicit drugs in parks, we're going to make sure that they're going to be treated appropriately, but that's up to the police. That's up to the courts to decide. I don't direct the police. I don't direct the courts.
We want to make sure we do everything we possibly can to save lives, not take lives away. Compassionate intervention was brought up, and I thank you very much for that question. But compassionate action is what we are committed to, and that's what this group represents. We are compassionately trying to find the right pathways forward.
We've had Dan Carter on this program, I guess on the agenda in the past, and he is a passionate spokesperson for this issue for obvious reasons. His history with alcohol and drug addiction, about which he's very open, makes him somebody who really needs to be listened to on this file. As the bill comes forward, though, what do you think we should be looking for?
Well, so the government has outlined some of what will be in the bill. This will not technically be in the legislation, but they have said $75.5 million is coming for shelter and support programs. That will include $5.5 million to move people who are currently in shelter spaces into more permanent housing. So you will free up those shelter spaces. $20 million to expand shelter spaces overall, and then $50 million to speed up the completion of affordable housing projects around the province. That money will be spent based on how close to completion these housing projects are. So what they're really aiming for is, a project where the planning is all in place, maybe even construction has already started, but they've hit a snag or something, and this is hopefully money that they can spend and get a bunch of quick wins across the province. They are also, it's not just money that we're talking about, they're also demanding more accountability from municipalities to ensure that provincial money is spent well. And then here's where more of the stick angle of this comes in. They are amending the Trespass to Property Act to create a new offense for people who continually and deliberately trespass on public or private property. They are also creating new provincial offenses for people who use illegal drugs in public spaces. That would result in a $10,000 fine or 6 months in prison. Since we are talking about the homeless, you can imagine that these $10,000 fines are it's not like they're going to be able to reach into their pockets and pay the fine. Yeah. So functionally, we're talking about prison terms. the government says it will explore alternatives to prison, such as treatment or rehabilitation, but unclear exactly how that will fit into this whole framework. The premier did rule out the idea of compulsory treatment, forcing people into confinement for rehabilitation and treatment, but this is an issue that has been raised before, and I suspect it will be raised again. Finally, Abacus Data has done some polling on this, and only 12% of people polled wanted stronger law enforcement measures. 34% wanted more affordable housing.
Those things are not necessarily inconsistent. You can have stronger measures and affordable housing, and I guess I would add here that whether he's found the right mix is up for the people to decide, but you can tell that the premier at his press conference very much wanted to do both a carrot and stick approach. He wanted very much to say, look, we're going to spend millions more to help people out here, but on the other hand, we're not going to put up with the current encampments any longer. Compassionate conservatism, if I can call it that.
Well, and it is also relevant to the question of the notwithstanding clause that we raised earlier, where in previous court decisions, the courts have enjoined municipalities from clearing these encampments in cases where there was no shelter alternative provided. And with the province moving forward and saying, we are providing shelter spaces and making sure that we are increasing the supply of affordable housing, but also these encampments got to go, you can see them making the argument that they will eventually, I assume, have to make in court, which is like, we are doing both the things.
All right, while we're on the issue of housing, let's stick with that because the Ontario Liberals have unveiled another major campaign-style commitment. The party leader, Bonnie Crombie, revealed details this week. Why don't you take us through some of the highlights of the Liberal plan?
Right. So a bunch of big announcements in this plan. Crombie, if the Liberals were to form government, the party would eliminate the Ontario land transfer tax for first-time homebuyers and downsizing seniors. The land transfer tax, if you've bought or sold a home in Ontario, you know this, but it's functionally a sales tax that applies to the sale of homes.
And it's a giant chunk of the final price.
Yes. Yeah. And if you live in Toronto, you pay both the provincial and the municipal land transfer tax. The Liberals are also proposing to scrap development charges on new homes under 3,000 square feet, what they call middle-class homes. So they are also proposing to make co-op housing easier to build, and they are promising to resolve landlord and tenant disputes in under 2 months. This one really caught my eye. They are proposing to provide emergency zero-interest loans to tenants who need help to make rent. This is modeled on pretty successful programs we've seen in places like Toronto and York Region, among others.
Since you mentioned York Region, we should also say, I think Stephen Del Duca, a week or two ago, the mayor of Vaughan, announced that he is reducing development charges in that municipality because he believes you can take $10,000, $20,000 off the price of a new home if you take those charges away. So he believes he is showing leadership by leading the pack on that kind of thing.
And we've seen similar moves in Burlington, I believe. There does seem to be a move afoot among various municipalities where I think they are realizing that, if nothing else, they are getting an immense amount of political pressure from both the federal and provincial governments. And I think a lot of councils are looking and saying, okay, where can we make reasonable cuts here? And obviously in Vaughan, they've arrived there.
So this is the Liberal contribution to the housing issue. We, of course, have seen the Progressive Conservative government weigh in this. How would you say the current Liberal plan differs, I guess, most significantly from what the Tories have on offer?
In terms of the approach to, getting more homes built, this is, I think, a more far-ranging plan than we've seen from certainly the government's policies thus far, in combination with other proposals the Liberals have made in terms of substantially liberalizing zoning, right? The Liberals have said that they'll allow 4 stories and 4plexes province-wide. That combined with the measures that they announced this week, I think that could be really effective. I've joked before on the podcast that nothing is a serious policy unless the dollars end with the word billions in it, and this would be billions of dollars. We haven't even mentioned all of the spending that we're talking about here. So that said, we don't know when the next election will be, but there is still time for the Ford government to introduce new housing policy. I kind of suspect they are going to want to have some major new housing policy to at least present to voters before they go into an election. We will see what that is and whether they nab some of these Liberal ideas or propose different ones of their own.
And with that, we're off to issue 3. With the end of the calendar year also comes the end of the government's legislative agenda. By the time our viewers and listeners hear this or see this, the House will have risen for the winter break, but not without the government having introduced some major bills in recent days. JMM, what's new here?
So we've already discussed the anti-encampment measures that the government will be introducing or has introduced. There are a few others that have come in the last week or two that caught my eye. There's Bill 231, the More Convenient Care Act, which is a bunch of healthcare reform measures. Bill 238, the Emergency Management Modernization Act, which, as the name implies, it makes a bunch of changes to the emergency management framework that we have here in Ontario. I'm going to talk about those two a bit more in the Your Column, My Column bit, because I wrote about those for TVO. There is a new bill making changes to long-term care. That's Bill 235. And then there's Bill 228, which pertains to wildland fires and underground CO2 storage. I'm going to find an excuse to write about that, I think, early in the new year, because the underground CO2 storage is one of these issues that has been bubbling away. We don't have to get into the details of all of these bills, but my point is that they are substantive bills. These are not naming Ontario's official flower kind of bills, right? The government has serious work.
You got something against the trillium?
I have nothing against the trillium. Okay. Of course I don't. But these are bills that are going to require serious legislative debate and committee time and the full sort of process. Some of these bills have already had their second reading debate and are going to committee phase. But in the case of, for example, the encampments bill that's introduced on the last day of the legislative sitting, they aren't going to get a substantive amount of debate. That's going to have to be debated when the House returns in February.
Hold that thought, because as we look at the legislative calendar, and if these are significant bills, the House will have to return in February, as it usually does, the day after Family Day, because they're taking a break now until then, in order to pass all these bills. Unless, of course, the House doesn't come back. Any betting on whether that's the case?
So I think we mentioned a few weeks ago that I'd heard some speculation from some MPPs that the House might not return after the winter break, that the long-rumored election call would happen either in January or in February before the scheduled return of the House. That's still possible. These bills, though, and particularly with the healthcare bill, but also with this new encampments bill, I do get the sense that this is a serious workload that the government really wants to address before they go to the fun of an election. I'm not ruling out the possibility of an early election call, but sitting here today now, I think I'm more leaning towards the House will come back in February. They will debate these bills, and then that tees up things like the government can present a budget. They can do all of the pomp and pageantry of a budget speech and enjoy that before they go into an election call.
It would be one of the things governments try not to do is hand ammunition over to the opposition parties. And if the government has spent a considerable amount of money and political currency having a big press conference, as they did yesterday, talking about all the things they needed to do, including potentially setting aside charter-protected rights in order to deal with homeless encampments, and then you opportunistically called an early election before bringing the House back to actually get those bills passed, boy, you've just handed the opposition a hammer to knock you all over the place with, haven't you?
Absolutely. And it also is related to the issue of Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump is not going to be inaugurated until, was it January 20th?
Yeah.
And, an election call before that would really call into question. I mean, one of the arguments that the government is mulling apparently about this early election call is the idea that we need to, give the voters a say on how we respond to this new change in our economic circumstances. Mm-hmm. But you can't really do that until after the inauguration, surely. Right?
You would think. And don't call me Shirley. And with that, we're off to talk about our columns. Okay, it's time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I chat about the columns we wrote for TVO.org over the past week. You had a bunch up this past week. Which one are you going to fancy us with today?
So as I mentioned, I am going to talk about Bill 231 and Bill 238. These are a pair of bills that are not directly, expressly about COVID, but like happy 5th anniversary, everybody, right? 5 years ago at this time were when the first patients in China were being hospitalized for COVID. These bills, the healthcare bill does a bunch of things that are not at all related to public health, but it does also make some changes to Ontario's public health legislation, including it gives the government more control over the decisions made by local medical officers of health. And if you turn your mind back to the pandemic, right, one of the issues at the time was that like we don't really have like a singular provincial public health system. We have this kind of weird federated system of like lots of little medical officers of health. And for reasons I'm not going to go into here, right, there was some frustration at the provincial level that they didn't really have like direct control over what every local medical officer was doing at the time. This now gives them direct political control over what kinds of public health orders a medical officer can issue when it comes to communicable diseases. So I think that's very obviously a response to some of the lessons learned from COVID. Then the Emergency Management Modernization Act doesn't do a ton in terms of substantially changing the way we manage emergencies, but I highlight it because if you recall in 2021, or was it late 2020, the Auditor General highlighted that it was kind of odd that we had this whole apparatus, this bureaucracy, Emergency Management Ontario, that was supposed to be the primary responder in cases of provincial emergencies, and it was mostly idle during certainly the early part of the pandemic. And the Auditor General said, like, this is $1 million agency that we just aren't using. Maybe we should reconsider that. I think with the changes made in this law, the government is sort of setting itself up to respond to future emergencies a bit more rationally. So just two examples of how we are still, 5 years later, still learning the lessons of COVID-19.
Good.
How about yourself, Steve?
Well, Sheldon, can I have a two-shot, please? I wrote a column this week on why Frank Sinatra's birthday of the 12th of December ought to be a national holiday. Actually, I didn't. I just wanted an opportunity to show this cute little thing here. Can we get any chance I can get a close-up shot of Mr. Sinatra holding a baseball there? Look at that. Isn't that a beautiful thing? Anyway, he's so cute. Can I leave? Yeah, I'm going to leave that there. What the heck? Makes me feel good. No, I did a column this week after having attended a speech last week by David Frum. David Frum, of course, originally from Toronto, but has lived in Washington for the last few decades, I guess. Journalist, author, well-known commentator in the United States, former speechwriter to President George W. Bush. The speech was essentially this: people, enough with the politically correct versions of history. It's time to get real. That essentially is what the speech was about. Enough with the Prime Minister telling Canadians that he thinks this country's treatment of Indigenous people is tantamount to genocide. Enough with judging our ancestors like Sir Johnny MacDonald and Egerton Ryerson through the prism of today's more modern values. Presentism, it's called. David had a lot more to say about all of these things, including some controversial things about residential schools and about mass graveyards of Indigenous children, the reality of which he says is now in much more serious doubt than the original allegations would suggest. It is controversial stuff, but he believes the pendulum of teaching history has swung too far away from empirically provable facts towards much more political correctness, and he is urging freer speech and a great clash and engagement of ideas as we deal with all of this. And I gave David a forum on our little website to talk about these things, and so your columns, my columns, they're all up on the website, tvo.org. We urge people, after we wet their whistle here with a little bit of discussion, to go to the website and check it out. Let's go to the mailbag. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always like it when you send us a note at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what's up this week?
So our first question comes from listener Paul Van de Ham in Mississauga, who writes, "Good morning, JMM and SP. Historically, the province has published new print editions of the Ontario Official Roadmap biannually. However, the Publications Ontario website lists the 2022-23 map as the current edition. Will there be a print edition of the 24-25 Ontario Official Roadmap? P.S. I miss the days where the names of the Premier, the Minister of Transportation, and the Minister of Tourism were prominently displayed on the cover of the map." Paul Vanderham, PN, Mississauga, Ontario.
That is great. Paul is a man after my own heart because before the day, you young people won't remember this, but in the days before GPS, we got these things. These were called maps, and you opened them up, and there's a map of the province of Ontario in there. And anyway, it's you know how the whole thing goes. What was really interesting was when, of course, you opened this up and spread it out over the wheel while you were driving and looked at the map and then looked out the windshield. I wouldn't recommend that, but we all did it.
Not the recommended
No,
manual
definitely
operation.
not. But apropos of Paul's point, our producer Matthew O'Meara reached out to the Ministry of Transportation and got some of these. Now look how sweet this is. Now this is back in the day where the premier of the day, William G. Davis, used to have his name there, and then James Snow, who was the Minister of Transportation, and you'd even had the Deputy Minister of Transportation's name on the
Larry
map as well.
Grossman's name on there,
and
too.
there's Larry Grossman over there, who was the Minister of Industry and Tourism. And those of you who drive in Halton Region, which was the riding Jim Snow used to represent, will know the James Snow Parkway, forgive me, is named after him. And yes, there used to be one of these maps published every year. And I know my dad just cleaned out his glove box the other day, and he probably had 30 of these things going back years and years. But this is how we used to get around before GPS. And I love the little tradition of having the premier and the two senior ministers with their names on the official road map of Ontario.
You can buy a hard copy of the current map on the Publications Ontario website for about $5, it seems. The ministry has a list of travel information centers where you can get one as well. You can also view the map as a PDF for free online, although please don't do so while you're driving. Stay away from screens.
Yeah, we shouldn't do that anymore. And we should add that there is a new road map for 2024-25 coming.
Right.
I wonder, will it have the Premier's name on it and the Minister of Transportation's name on it and the Deputy Minister of Transportation's name on it? I don't know. We'll have to, we're just going to let the suspense linger as we wait for the map to come out and then check and see whether or not
I feel
all
like we're going to follow up on this.
Yeah,
in the new
we are
year.
definitely following up in the new year on this. Okay, let's move on here. Here is viewer and or listener Marty Johnson, or Johnston, forgive me, Marty, I don't know if you pronounce the T, but you live in Ottawa and you write the following. Hi, onpoli podcast. Garbage and landfills are always contentious debates, expensive, and take long-term planning. This is not something that governments like to deal with. Since Ontario sends a large amount of garbage to the USA, what would happen if that got slapped with a 25% tariff? How fast could different levels of the government in Canada move in order to respond to a lack of places to send garbage? Okay, JMM, what do we think on that?
So the United States is our biggest partner, customer, is this the appropriate recipient when it comes to our garbage? Some 900,000 metric tons go between our countries every year. In terms of costs, plastic trade, for example, represents $18.8 million a year. All of that to say is that there is a cost to this, and those costs will go up if our exports are subject to tariffs. There is, in fact, because of course there is, a custom tariff schedule that the Canadian government maintains for different types of solid waste.
I'm just blue skying here, but if they did slap tariffs on our garbage that we'd bring down there, is there the possibility, I guess, that we would have that dry up and build more landfills up here?
I mean, that's a natural question. It's theoretically possible, but siting and building modern landfills, these are not just holes in the ground anymore. We have all sorts of environmental and hygiene rules about modern landfills, and also you have to make sure they don't generate a ton of methane as things decompose. Mm-hmm. This all takes a lot of time. And this government in particular, the Ford government, has arguably made it harder to site new landfills. In 2020, they gave municipal councils the right to say no to new landfills in their environment. Previously, the provincial government had regarded landfills as a kind of like a provincial priority. Not sexy infrastructure, but important infrastructure. And so municipalities did not have a direct right to refuse. They now have that right. I actually haven't checked in with people in the industry about how that's going in the last little while, but it's certainly one of the questions to ask.
There's another one to follow up on. Okay, you got the next letter.
Right. We have another question related to the United States, a lot of those lately. This from John Quickaboom in Welland, who writes, in light of the recent terrific rumblings from the USA elected Donald Trump, it seems that some Canadian provincial premiers want to make direct overtures to the USA, bypass the feds, to address his plans. Does Ontario have the legislative power to have its own foreign ambassador and or negotiate directly with the USA? Cheers, John.
Not to correct you, but he called him Donnie Trump.
Yes.
He didn't say Donald, he said Donnie. Okay, here's the reality. Nowadays, Doug Ford essentially is our foreign affairs ambassador for the province of Ontario. He meets with the National Governors Association in Washington. He has close ties to American governors. I know he's got a bit of a relationship with Tim Walz, who was, of course, the vice president on the ticket for the Democrats in the last national election. He's on the phone with governors of the United States all the time. He's made recent appearances on Fox News in order to talk directly to American decision makers about the importance of the tariff issue to several American states. We should, however, point out that Ontario does have actual ambassadors who do foreign affairs all over the world. And it's not just Canada that has ambassadors, but the province of Ontario does as well. They are called agent generals. And we have had them, for example, in London, UK, since the beginning of the 20th century. Some names will sound familiar. Robert Nixon, the former four-time Ontario Liberal leader, was, quote unquote, our man in London during the early 1990s. Bob Rae, who was the premier at the time, appointed Mr. Nixon to that job. Adrienne Clarkson, there's a name that people will remember. She was our agent general in Paris in the 1980s. Bill Davis gave her that job. This, of course, before she was the governor general. We've had agent generals in Tokyo. We've had them in New York, in Chicago, in Dallas. They're not necessarily permanent, right? These locations can change depending on budgets and depending on where the government of the day finds it important to be or not to be. So, do we have ambassadors? Kind of, yeah. They're called agent generals, and this is what they do.
Yeah, and you've also got cabinet ministers who travel a lot, and they also sort of bring the agenda of the government to other shores. We've got Vic Fedeli, the Minister of Economic Development, Job Development, and Trade in Ontario, and it's a great gig in the sense that he gets to travel all over the place and is trying to woo employers here to Ontario, as well as, I guess, represent our industries elsewhere in the world. I should also mention Stephen Lecce, the Minister of Energy and Electrification. I mean, one of the big industries here in Ontario is nuclear power, and both Minister Lecce and his predecessor spend a lot of time trying to pitch Canadian nuclear reactors to other countries. So, is it foreign policy per se? In the strictest sense, no, but it sure looks and sounds and smells like it.
I got a good example from almost 40 years ago. We used to have a cabinet minister in the Liberal government of David Peterson named Monty Quinter. Mr. Quinter, for a while, was the oldest MPP of all time. I think he served into his 90s. He used to be the Minister for Industry, Tourism, and Technology, something like that. MITT. And we always said it stood for Monty, I Travel and Travel, because that's all he did. He was on planes all the time. Anyway, on we go. Next question is from Neil White in Cambridge, Ontario, who writes the following. Hi, thank you guys for the podcast. I listen every week and think you have the best news podcast in Canada. Well, thank you, Neil. Regarding your discussion of Ontario spending millions on ads in the U.S. to influence the policies of the incoming administration, is there anything that bars Ontario from buying Trump media stock, spending money at Trump hotels, or otherwise more directly investing in the incoming president? We know other countries have done this, and it seems like a potentially better investment than hoping Mr. Trump sees and is swayed by ads on TV. Thanks, Neil in Cambridge. P.S. Steve, I hope you get a chance to get up to Brantford for a Bulldogs game. I know Hamilton misses the team, but they are thriving in the telephone city. Actually, Neil, I do know this. I know the Bulldogs are doing really well in Brantford. I think they're talking about possibly a new arena in Brantford because the team is doing so well there and attracting crowds. And my good friend, who I bet is watching, Peggy Chapman, who runs the Bulldogs Foundation, constantly tells me that the team is doing great. So, Peggy, I will get to a game, I promise, one of these days. Now, Neil, to your question. To curry favor with the Trump administration during Donald's first term, several nations spent lavishly at Trump hotels. I think the former president made almost $4 million between 2017 and 2020. The Malaysian prime minister in 2017 spent more than $250,000. President Trump praised him for doing so. Is there anything preventing Canadian or Ontario government officials from spending just as much money to sway the president? No, there is not. And, Neil may have put his finger on a good way to ingratiate this province with the incoming president, although there's something about it that just rubs you the wrong way. But, we know the way he does business down there.
Yeah. So MPPs have to disclose their own personal financial expenditures under various ethics laws that we have. The MPP Accountability and Transparency Act. As an official act of government, like could Doug Ford visit Washington and ensure that he and his party stay in a Trump-owned hotel? Yes. Like they can absolutely do that, and the people of Ontario would pay for that. We talked last week about how the Ministry of Finance, maintains not just like cash holdings, but like has bought stock previously. Could the Ministry of Finance decide to buy a stock associated with Donald Trump? They could.
Wouldn't you call that sucking up of the worst kind?
Oh, yes.
But it might be successful.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is just the reality of what politics is going to look like for the next 4 years. So, it's a lot of this stuff is unseemly, let's say. But I would be shocked if somebody in the Ontario government hadn't at least considered some of this stuff.
That is the job of the public service. Put options out there for politicians, and let's see what they do. We got one more here, I think. We got a final note from listener Judy Daniel, who writes, "Love that you invite us into your conversation on various topics. I suspect the two of you always have such conversations, whether there's an audience or not. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and enthusiasm and perspicacity." Oh my God, let me say that again. Perspicacity. Perspicacity. Boy, that's a great word, which obviously I have difficulty saying. Merry Christmas, Judy Daniel from Mount Forest, Ontario. I think I know one other person from Mount Forest, Ontario. Robin Doolittle, Globe and Mail. Used to be a champion skater. Excellent reporter for the Globe and Mail. I think she's from Mount Forest as well. Where the welcoming sign on the water tower reads, "High, healthy, and happy." That is a wonderful thing. Well, let me just say, yes, we do, of course, have conversations when the cameras are not on about all things onpoli. And I just want to say for the record, given that we're the day after Mr. Sinatra's birthday, we never talk about something stupid. We are not strangers in the night, and neither one of us does it my way. We always do it our way. There we go. You're okay with that, JMM?
I am absolutely okay with that.
Okay, fantastic. Give the email address one more time.
The email address is onpolitics@tvo.org. So if you have anything you want to ask us about content on the show, or just want to use the word perspicacity in a sentence, once again, onpolitics@tvo.org.
If you can use it, you're a better person than me. Happy birthday again, Mr. Sinatra. 109 years ago yesterday. That is the onpoli podcast for this Friday, December 13th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it. Good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks, as always, to our wonderful studio crew for making the video podcast happen. And we're going to do a special shout out this week to the person I think who is the youngest person in our crew. I think she is.
Okay.
Sloan Westlake, who I jokingly always call Eastlake, but her name is actually Westlake, who runs the telecue so we know what to say and does lots of other stuff around here. So Sloan, best of the season to you, and we'll see you all in the new year, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.